name Silent Hill is brought up, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it the original tetralogy of games that came out 20 years prior? Iconic games that helped to cement the horror genre in the sphere of gaming alongside its contemporaries like Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, and Fatal Frame. Or perhaps you may be thinking about the series' rocky history after the disbandment of Team Silent, the IP being handed over to various Western developers who seem to misunderstand the fundamental ideas and concepts of the franchise as a whole, and only manage to produce one mediocre iteration after another. Or maybe you might be thinking of the movies. Okay, let's be real, no one is actually thinking of the movies.
Hasta luego.
To say that the past 2 decades hasn't been kind to Silent Hill would be an understatement, and aside from the fairly well-received reimagining of the original game, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, and the genuine hype and excitement of the long-since cancelled PT, aka Silent Hills, the series has been laying dormant and has been out of the eyes of the gaming hemisphere for the past 12 years. The last original game in the series being the rather mediocre Silent Hill Downpour and the release of the critically divisive HD Collection. The less said about the Comic Sans font, the better. So, when it was finally revealed in October of 2022 that Konami would be cooperating with Polish-based studio Bolstered Team to develop and publish a remake of Silent Hill 2, it came as a bit of a surprise that the series was finally returning after a decade-long hiatus and was quickly met with a healthy dose of skepticism. Most were still wary of Konami's ill-gained reputation from their many blunders during the mid-2010s, and while Bloober Team had a few solid titles under their belt like Layers of Fear and Observer, their overall repertoire of games tended to be a mixed bag at best, and the fact that they were being trusted to remake one of the most beloved and iconic horror games of all time didn't really do anything to assuage the growing concern of the Silent Hill fanbase. Early previews of the game showcasing character redesigns were met with mixed criticism over their new looks, with some fans either saying that several of the main characters had been altered too much from the source material. Doubts only grew worse with the release of questionable and poorly thought out promotion material within the past several months leading up to the release of the game. The combat reveal trailer, in particular, was panned by critics and fans alike, understandably so considering that the series' strengths lay within its strong storytelling, foreboding atmosphere, and challenging puzzles. The fact that Konami's marketing team thought it was a good idea to focus on combat was a confusing and bizarre move on their end. And while the release of the gameplay trailer helped to mitigate most of the concerns felt by the fans by showing that the game hadn't abandoned its roots, there was still a lingering air of doubt that hung around, much like the thick fog that lingered around Silent Hill itself. With a release date set for early October and huge expectations riding upon its shoulder, only time would tell if the remake would be able to live up to the standard of its original namesake and be a huge hit, or if it would be yet another dud in a long series of duds that could potentially be our final trip to Silent Hill as we know it. And despite everything it had going against it, despite the caution and skepticism shown by fans and critics alike, despite all the doubts and criticism that Bloober Team had to contend with, it took to the task of remaking one of the greatest horror games of all time.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
And knocked it out of the park. The Silent Hill 2 remake is phenomenal and may very well be one of the best games I've played in quite some time. From the very beginning at the overpass looking over the town, to the final boss and the closing narration had me completely enthralled. I felt invested in the characters and the ominous presence of the town, while also being genuinely curious over the mystery surrounding main character James and his deceased wife Mary. And whether you're a returning veteran of the series, ready to once again explore the dreary streets of Silent Hill, or you're a newcomer like me, diving in headfirst like we were diving into the cold water of Toko Lake, I cannot recommend this game enough. Hey, I'm that origami guy, and I welcome you to my Silent Hill 2 Remake review.
That origami guy!
Thanks.
But I think you should stay away. This town, there's something wrong with it. And it's not just the fog either.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. It's kind of hard to explain, but
I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I don't really care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.
Now, I want to be completely transparent with everyone who may be watching this review. As I've already mentioned, I'm a newcomer to the series, and I've never played any of the games before the remake, including the original Silent Hill 2. The closest I've ever gotten was watching playthroughs of the games many years ago, and only have a very tentative understanding of the lore and synopsis of each individual game. As such, this review will be limited to my thoughts on the remake version only, and any differences I do mention will be fairly limited at best. With that out of the way, let's get right into the fog-infested heart of this game. The game opens up in a dingy and worn-down public restroom, and we're introduced to our main character, James Sunderland. It's explained in the opening narration that James has come to the scenic town of Silent Hill, Maine, a rural resort town in the New England countryside, after receiving a mysterious letter from his wife Mary, who says that she's waiting for him in their special place. There's just one problem. Mary, as we soon learn, is dead, and has been dead for nearly 3 years after succumbing to an undisclosed disease before the events of the game. James, troubled by this development, perplexed as to how his late wife may be alive and waiting for him, journeys out to the town to begin his investigation, and embarks on a quest to uncover the truth of the matter, and soon becomes embroiled with a dark and sinister force that lays within the seemingly quiet getaway. Along the way, James meets a cast of characters who are all drawn to Silent Hill for their own reasons. Upon entering the outskirts of the town, James soon meets Angela Orozco, a young and troubled woman who came to Silent Hill looking for her mother and who warns James of the possible dangers contained within the unassuming town. Later on, we're introduced to Eddie Dombrowski, a skittish and portly young man who seemingly appears harmless at first glance, but may be holding back a more violent side to him. And finally, a young girl named Laura, an orphan that managed to make her way to Silent Hill on her own and may have some kind of connection with James' late wife Mary, though she seems to have some kind of grudge against James himself. Further rounding out the cast, we have Maria, an enigmatic and mysterious woman who looks eerily similar to Mary, and seems to have an odd fixation on James himself. And lastly, we have a being known only as Pyramid Head, a bizarre and otherworldly thing whose motivation is unknown to all, beyond the fact that their mere presence brings a sense of stomach-churning dread, and that it seems to be stalking James throughout his journey. And the last but most crucial member of the cast is the town of Silent Hill itself. A town that was once a beautiful and quiet getaway for many, now a run-down and dilapidated shell of its former self, that's now surrounded by what appears to be both paranormal and supernatural forces that challenges James as the main obstacle that he must ultimately overcome. As we progress further into the story, we slowly begin to unravel the mysteries and motivations behind what drove our cast of characters to come to Silent Hill in the first place, but also begin to get insight about the town itself and the dark history that it hides away behind its fog-covered streets. Silent Hill 2 follows the same gameplay principles and design philosophies of its fellow horror game peers, and that its gameplay loop can be broken down into 3 key aspects: exploration, combat, and puzzle solving. From the get-go, the game instantly enraptures you with looming uneasiness as you begin making your way into Silent Hill, a lingering sense of dread as you realize something is just off about the place as you begin the first steps of your journey. From the unnatural fog that surrounds and obscures what's in front of you, almost making you feel claustrophobic with how it never seemingly lets up, to the run-down and dreary look of the town, a once beautiful countryside getaway now completely abandoned and holding a sinister presence within. The game thrives off making you feel uneasy and certain as you play. Even the save points in the game are unsettling, glowing red squares that when you use them, you're greeted by a visage of James staring right back at us, almost like he's aware of our presence.
It's like skull.
The further you delve into the game, the more you start to feel like Silent Hill is preying upon James' fears and is stringing him along for some unknown purpose. The game does an excellent job of conveying this through environmental storytelling, usually through notes and memos scattered around the game that gives background on the former residents, or that almost seems specifically addressed to James himself, or even just outright nonsensical ramblings of individuals who've gone mad within the confines of the town. This isn't just limited to notes and memos either, but graffiti scattered around the walls, and even old newspaper clippings helps to subtly add more lore and additional ambiance to the world. However, navigating said world isn't easy, and you'll find out soon enough that it's very easy to lose track of where you are and where you need to go. Thankfully, you'll always have access to a map that's been provided to you in every new location you enter into, easily proving its use and giving you a general layout of the surrounding area and an idea where to go to next. James will frequently update the map with rooms he's either been in or can't get access to, and will even mark points of interest or jot down codes or puzzle clues on them for you to reference when needed. The game even goes as far as to physically show James pulling the map out and scribbling on it whenever he updates it, which is a nice bit of immersive detail that adds to that lost sense of direction one might be feeling in James's place. Yes, the map is a handy tool, and one you'll be using quite frequently. And when I say frequently, what I really mean is you'll barely walk 5 feet to your next destination before pulling the map up again to double check you're going in the right direction, before barely walking another 5 feet before you pull it out again to triple check you're going in the right direction. It's a habit that you quickly develop, and one you will be doing all the freaking time. A tradition that dates back even to the original games in the series, and even on repeat playthroughs where you know where everything is and where you need to go, you'll still find yourself habitually checking the map out of reflex. Though I'd argue that's not necessarily a bad thing, and even on repeat playthroughs, it's still fairly easy to get turned around in the dark corridors and hallways of the interior levels you'll be traveling through. The game isn't just dark in tone and theming, but also completely pitch black, with very little lighting to guide you around the levels, forcing you to rely on your in-game flashlight to be your literal shining light in the darkness. While this does a lot to enhance the tension of the game by obscuring whatever danger might be lurking in the shadows, it's unfortunately a bit of a double-edged sword, especially when you factor in the purposely obtuse level design of the various areas you explore. And nothing kills attention faster than when you've had to retread the same dark hallway you've already traveled through several times, desperately trying to find the missing item you need to proceed forward into the next section of the level. Despite this, I found this to be more of a minor inconvenience, and I didn't feel like it took away from my overall experience of the game, and that it's one of those things that will come down to personal taste. So, if you're struggling like I was, don't be afraid to adjust the gamma setting to be a little brighter if need be. James will have his progress impeded throughout the game by various roadblocks, locked doors that require missing keys, coded walks that require a specific combo, and even strange contraptions that are missing pieces required to operate. As such, he'll be required to track down these missing combinations or components in what I can only describe as one overly convoluted scavenger hunt. Most of these are either hidden behind some sort of environmental puzzle, or are often affixed with a riddle that you have to parse through to get the solution. Plainly speaking, these are obviously meant to pad the game out to some degree, but I don't necessarily feel like that's a bad thing, and often at times hunting down what you need to proceed can feel pretty rewarding. You feel a certain sense of triumph when you finally found what you're looking for, and nothing beats the aha moment you feel whenever you solve a puzzle. It helps that the game does an impressive job of cleverly alluding to how to solve said puzzles or track down missing pieces, doing a fine balancing act of giving us just enough information to work with without outright telling us what to do. You really feel like the game is rewarding you for trying to work things out on your own, and respects and values the time you put into it, instead of feeling like it's treating you like you're some idiot who has to have his hand walk through every single step. With that said, it often feels like finding everything you need to actually solve these puzzles and progress through the game can take a tedious amount of time. The remake's twice the length of the original game, with each level taking up to a bare minimum of an hour and a half to progress through, even longer on your first playthrough when you're learning the ins and outs of where everything is located at to proceed forward. Even on repeat playthroughs where you already have advanced knowledge and know where you need to go, it can still feel like a slog to get through each section of the game, and that I feel as though Blooper Team could have stood to trim out the fat to allow for some better pacing. Hopefully, this is some feedback they'll take into consideration for future remakes of the series. I like to finish off this section by mentioning that you can actually adjust what level of difficulty you want your puzzles to be at the beginning of every new playthrough. These are divided between light, standard, and hard, and will mostly affect the puzzles by making hints less obvious and by changing up the riddles and environmental puzzles to be harder than they were before. It's a nice bit of accessibility offered to you that allows you to curate your playstyle for the game. Whether that's as someone who's a first-time player wanting to be eased into the game and who's worried about struggling with the puzzles, a returning player who wants more of a challenge and is ready to put their puzzle-solving skills to the test, or as someone who just wants to sit back and enjoy the story and wants to breeze through the puzzles, there's always an option made readily available for you. Finally, we have our final portion, and that's discussing combat. And combat in the remake is practically night and day compared to the original's more simplistic approach. It's been fleshed out and given depth beyond just clumsily clubbing an enemy until they die. It's more fast-paced and exhilarating, but not in a way where it feels like it's over the top. Every strike with your melee weapon has weight to it. You really feel the impact as it makes contact with whatever monster you're fighting. Both James and the monsters can dodge and weave attacks, making it feel like every fight is a deadly dance between them. When you combine that with how you'll often be fighting in dark, cramped spaces with very little lighting, and it really starts to feel like you're in a life or death situation, and a lot of combat encounters can really get the heart pumping. Some people have critiqued the fact that James only has one melee combo, saying that it's boring and stale. I can understand where they're coming from, and it is a valid criticism, but allow me to play devil's advocate. I think James only knowing one combo is more fitting to not just the situation, but to his character as well. He's not former military or someone who's had any kind of prior fighting experience. He's a normal average Joe who's been thrust into a very abnormal and terrifying situation, and everything he does is fueled off instincts and fear-driven adrenaline. The game does a good job of really emphasizing James' lack of combat prowess by showing that his swings are clumsy and excessive. At times he'll even be short of breath as he tries to throw a weak swing only to have to take a moment to recover. And you can tell that James is putting his heart and soul into those final downward swings or curb stomps he does to make sure an enemy stays down, which I know for a fact I'd certainly do if I was in his shoes. This also extends to a lack of firearm usage, as James also has access to several firearms at his disposal that he'll collect throughout the game. His aim is unsteady and sways a bit as he tries to focus his aim on whatever is in front of him. I think it really adds to the tension and heightens the fear, knowing that you're playing as just some guy as opposed to some grizzled ex-combat veteran or some action-oriented hero. Yes, the combat in the game does feel good, but it's not without its flaws. Much like fumbling around in the dark trying to find the last pieces you need to solve a puzzle can be tedious at times, fighting in the game can quickly deteriorate from feeling like an exhilarating deathmatch to becoming more of a boring slog you're forced to wade through at times. There's really only a handful of enemies in the game, and while each one is unique in design and their fighting styles vary from one another, once you fought one of them, you've really fought all of them. You never really have to develop any kind of strategy for them, or really have to think tactically beyond the sparse number of times there's more than one enemy in a room. It really boils down to ducking and weaving as you hit them with your melee weapon, shooting them if you got the ammo, or if they're in awkward spots, or a combination of shooting them to weaken them, then finishing them off with your melee weapon, and you basically rinse and repeat. Not helping matters is that enemies also seem spongy at times, soaking in a fair amount of punishment before going down, and even at times outright ignoring attacks as if they have iframes. I can't say for sure whether that's by design or not, but it does tend to add to that tedious feeling when you're trying to get past a fight and it feels like it's going on longer than it should. Thankfully, there's still always the option to just run past most of the enemies in the game and not bother with combat at all. However, there are times when fighting is either unavoidable or it's just easier to kill an enemy so they'll be out of your way. In short, combat is fun and intuitive to pick up on and feels great in short bursts, but over prolonged play can eventually start to feel dull as you fight the same enemy with the same strategies with little to no variety. At its best, it makes every encounter feel like a heart-pumping deathmatch, while at its worst, it makes every encounter feel like an annoyance while you're just trying to get by and complete your current objective. Much like setting puzzle difficulty, you can also set the difficulty of the combat to be easier or harder depending on your preference. So, if you're not particularly good at fighting, or you just don't want to toil around with the more tedious aspects of combat, you can always set it to the lowest difficulty and quickly work your way through most encounters without too much effort. The Silent Hill 2 Remake is a solid horror game, and one that I think everyone should really sit down and experience, even if they're not necessarily a horror game fan. The game excels at building a surreal and ominous atmosphere that puts you on edge, without going excessively overboard to the point that it feels like it's trying too hard to scare you, while offering a well-crafted and emotionally impactful narrative, with characters whose motives and reasons will leave you engaged and wanting more. It's by no means without its flaws. Combat can get a little dull, levels feel like they go on a little longer than they need to be, and some minor inconveniences in the form of the game being too dark at times and the interactive prompts being a little finicky to activate. However, I don't see any of these being massive deal breakers, and the game more than makes up for these faults by being narratively engaging and being a well-polished, mechanically sound game that has very few blemishes and is an overall smooth experience. I will say in my playthrough, there were some issues with graphical bugs and performance, and that this is something that's been shared across the board by others who've played the game. But by the time this review is up, Blooper Team will have put out several patches that should have fixed most of these issues. The game has a lot of replayability to offer as well. There are 8 endings to get in total, 6 from the original game plus 2 brand new ones added in by Blooper Team, as well as collectibles in the forms of glimpses of the past, areas that were once prominent in the original Silent Hill 2 that have been phased out for new reworked areas, but left in the remake as a nod to the original, and strange photos, a series of Polaroids that James can come across in his travels that seem to have some kind of obtuse narrative to them that's open to interpretation by the players. And I think that's honestly a wrap. I went into the Silent Hill 2 remake being unsure of what to expect, only knowing that the original was, and still is, held in high praise for being one of the best horror games ever made. And if I could sum up what I played with one saying, it would be the following: I finally get it. I finally get why people hold this game to such high praise and standard, and that I thoroughly enjoyed my playthrough of the game, even despite the gripes I had with it. And I hope that, maybe, my review will have convinced you to finally take to the fog-filled streets of Silent Hill for yourself. I'm that Origami Guy, and I'd like to thank you all for watching. Stay golden, my friends.
He's just standing there, menacingly!